I'm Nicole Connor, and you are currently listening to the Grand Rising Experience podcast. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm so happy to have you here. Today I want to dive into imposter syndrome, more specifically, how imposter syndrome has shown up throughout my life, both in a conscious and subconscious way, and driven some of the experiences that I've had, but also how it seems to get thrust upon us as well. I've talked about it before, and scarcity and lack programming really is what rules the current matrix that we live inside of. And our world as we know it cannot thrive without that victim consciousness and the feeling that we don't have enough or that we are not enough. And specifically, if you are in the digital space as a creator or a consumer, which is pretty much everyone, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. Specifically when it comes to social media and various marketing platforms and how we are taught to both put our content out into the world, but also as a consumer, how we're being programmed to receive it. As I always say, I can only speak about this through my own lived experience and how I've been navigating it myself, which is why I've been spending the past few months unlearning how to be in the context of work and business. I've always had this dream and goal that how I choose to live my life is how I support myself, that there is no delineation between life and business, which ultimately leads to the $1,000,000 question. How can I present my mission to the world in a way that feels aligned, authentic, and inspired, and still pay my bills? I've been dabbling in entrepreneurship now since about 2006, but I've always kept one foot in the corporate world because the pull of those golden handcuffs is real, and the safety and perceived security that comes with getting a regular paycheck, especially in a world where it can feel like you don't have control over the cost of living. So after spending years learning from marketing and automation and brand and niche and finance and other air quote experts, all who come with persuasive formulas for success, and then trying to apply those formulas even though they felt deeply unaligned, and coming into experiences where I've been told that I don't have what it takes to be an entrepreneur simply because I don't resonate with a lot of the experts and their pathways to achieving success, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. My spirit simply won't allow it. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who feels this way. And it's leaving me with the feeling that I'm not here to chase or scare or manipulate anyone into hearing what I have to say, because I feel so deeply rooted in my mission and my purpose that I'm now playing a long game. And it's one where trust and authority and value is generated and exchanged through the art of learning out loud, not through the highlight reel. So as I've been pondering this over the past few months, I do what I do best, which is start looking into the definitions and the etymology of words to really start to understand why we believe what we believe and how the language and the words, which ultimately is our frequency and vibration that we emit into the world, where do they come from? How have they conditioned us to believe what we believe? And this led me to the definition and looking into the word entrepreneur. The word entrepreneur originates from the 13th century French verb entreprendre, which I'm really sorry for anyone who's francophone, which means to undertake or do something. But by the 16th century, entreprendre, the verb, had been transformed into the noun entrepreneur, which means someone who undertakes a business project. And what I found when I looked at the word undertake is that it tends to be a little bit more passive than active. It's very different to undertake something versus to do something. And this is always where things start to get a little tricky, because when personification precedes action, aka being before doing, it can create projections and perceptions that become detrimental to the art of creating anything of intrinsic value. And I think it also hits at this idea of law of attraction, which could take me down a rabbit hole in another day. But when we look at the law of attraction, it wants you to personify the feeling of, and it can create situations and outcomes where people are trying to project a feeling into the future and bypassing the critical step of doing and taking the actions required to get to that desired feeling. And it's one of those tricky little mistresses that have popped up within the spiritual community that I think has hijacked the power of being able to connect to your higher source by creating a sidestep around the most important function that we as humans need to embody, which is the act of doing, which leads to the act of learning, which is where our knowledge and wisdom becomes distilled from. But I digress. So getting back to the entrepreneur, it also perpetuates the belief of have versus have not, and is the root of the employer and the employee relationship, which is just a mask of the owner and slave mentality. So how many verbs, if we look back through the English language specifically, have been transformed into nouns in an effort to disempower and breed victim consciousness? I mean, how many people are employees within businesses because they feel that they don't have what it takes to be the entrepreneur? Simply because we have this misnomer and misunderstanding around the origin of the word and the actual meaning of it and what it means to be an entrepreneur. This is where it gets into the marketing and what we're taught it means to be an entrepreneur. It's the personification before the art of doing. And yes, you could argue that being an entrepreneur requires a certain mindset, but above mindset, it requires the skill set. And the skill set is the act of doing. I mean, I just think of some of the corporations that I've worked in, and one of the biggest pain points that usually happens inside of a business, specifically between your C-suite and your executives and the frontline employees, is that there's such a huge disconnect between what the employees are required to do and how they are required to do it versus the understanding of the people that make the decisions on a daily basis that affect how they perform and carry out their job. That's the difference between being and doing. So diving into the word entrepreneur just reaffirmed the chasm that exists between presumptive literacy, what we assume and believe things to be, versus the wisdom that gets derived from the act of learning. And this is just the beginning. It's like the tip of the iceberg of the unlearning that I need it to embody, because in reality, and I'm sure most of you will find yourself in the same position, is that I've been in a state of entreprendre my entire life. And this shedding phase that I'm currently in feels very familiar and very similar to the first 4 or 5 months of the wellness sabbatical that I took in 2017, 2018. And it feels familiar because during that time I would attend social functions and was confronted with the fact that new introductions always led with, what do you do? Where do you work? Not, who are you? And that's because when you're currently not doing anything in the traditional meaning of the phrase, as in I was not working at that time, I was focusing strictly on my health, the identity crisis and the shame spiral that those questions can invoke if you don't have a solid sense of self is real. And it was also showing me that I needed to find new rooms and new people. But I really was just kind of on the edge of awareness of that at that time. And that's a story for another day. But this became a pivotal time in my life that really forced me to confront the truth of who I was. And not only confront, but take full responsibility for it so that I could begin to accept it. And that truth being that I'm a jack of all trades. Almost like a generalist. And it's because I've always followed my curiosity and said yes to things that light me up and expand my skill set, and no thank you to the things that felt restrictive and repressive. Now, typically, our brains are wired for familiarity because familiar equals safe. And traditionally in North American culture, society covets specialization and a very linear pathway, because being able to label and place someone else neatly inside of a box tends to make us feel a little more comfortable and at ease. And it does this because it allows us to accept or reject someone at face value based on a stereotypical identity. So when we're thinking about work and business and career, if you hear someone say, I'm a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a mechanic or a stay-at-home mom, you kind of know what to do with that. And based on that chosen career path, you can set up an identification process as to whether or not this is someone that you share values with or not. It's not always true, but it's kind of what our brain just does. So being a generalist, this jack of all trades, is many things, but linear and boxable and stereotypical, not so much. And in contrast to societal standards, not living this linear and prescribed life when you're around a group of people who are can leave you feeling very out of place, misunderstood, and honestly, like you just don't have your shit together. And I know this because my resume over the past 20 years to an untrained and uneducated eye is a mess. It's all over the map. It does not make any sense. I have worked in residential and commercial lighting sales and lighting design. I have been hired as both a residential and commercial interior designer. I worked for a boutique hotel company doing their brand and marketing strategy. I've managed boutique furniture stores. I worked in a law firm in their document reproduction center. And then because of my mad organizational skills, I was promoted to become a content and data coordinator, which was essentially building an online precedent database. Those same organizational skills led me into offshore private equity, where I was on the front line of creating a brand new business line that helped multi-billion-dollar corporations better track and manage and administer their companies around the world. I've worked as an executive assistant in high net worth life insurance, which is really trippy, and I don't think a lot of people understand what happens in that space. And I'll probably talk about that another day because holy shit. Then I went back to my construction roots and was working as a product manager for flooring for international distributors. And then I finally made the leap to go independent and labeled myself at that time as a citizen journalist and researcher and sovereign strategist, which brings me to present day, where I'm taking the culmination of those skills and see myself as a transformational writer, speaker, and course creator. So as random and disconnected as my resume appears, it's also always given me like this safety blanket and a title that I could throw on to appease the people that were surrounding me. But I also allowed it to become a chip on my shoulder because I've had family members say to me, Nicole, when are you going to get your shit together? Because my resume is all over the place. At that time, I didn't see it as the opinion of someone who was perhaps less courageous than I was. And I allowed that just to fester into shame and block me from seeing the true beauty and blessing of what I was creating for myself through the process. Now, if we want to talk about education, the only certified training I hold is in interior design. All other acquired knowledge and skills is like this personalized brew of experience, self-study, and my superpower, which is my innate willingness to be curious and adaptable, resilient, and hella uncomfortable. This superpower has cultivated my ability to grow through challenges and have deep faith and trust in my ability to know that I can always figure things out, regardless of what's thrown at me. And as of now, April 2023, transforming pain into power and purpose is the closest, quote, niche or personal brand statement I've been able to develop because I feel that it accurately represents and reflects the intersection of my lived experience and personal interests, paired with the skills and knowledge that I've cultivated through intense self-healing and self-discovery. And it's become this specialized skill forged from the holistic synthesis of everything I have required of myself to reach my achievements and goals in pursuit of self-mastery. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because the world is rapidly changing, and the current ways of doing business and earning a living is not healthy nor sustainable, and new ways of doing and being are going to require that we personally and collectively undergo a transformation that allows the abundance embedded within the intersection of our values and interest and experience, which I like to call your V, to innovate how we share our mission in the world and elevate ourselves and therefore our communities. So it's taken me about 39 years of lived experience to be able to find the beauty of ma vie, which, for fun is life in French. So it feels a little poetic, given that we started going down this rabbit hole with a French verb. In order for me to really find my vie, there's 3 beliefs that I've had to transform in order to not only identify, but harness its power. So the first thing I had to do was challenge the definition of success. So the pathway to conventional success is just no longer viable, or at least it won't be for much longer. And I've worked alongside and been mentored by profit-driven visionaries who create the technologies and workflows and automations and efficiencies that breed hyper-productivity. And I'm talking about the kind of productivity that has the ability to generate immense wealth. And we're talking billions. I've worked for 4 billionaires. The first one when I was 24. So I have up close experience with what this looks like. In my experience, this generation, this creation of wealth has come through unsustainable business models. And these are business models that rely on the expertise of others. And these are models that more often than not, when you look at the employee pool, lead to addictions and deviant behavior and eventually debilitating burnout. And over the past 3 years, I've struggled. The struggle has been real to not throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of what I've learned, because the knowledge that I've gained through these experiences has immense value. However, the level of discernment required to not abuse myself while implementing this accumulated knowledge has become a deeply spiritual practice. What we consider the status quo as of right now, it hasn't worked for a very long time. And it's because building anything on a foundation that is void of genuine care, connection, and lived experience is destined to crumble. And far too many people have been playing fast and loose with ethics and morals and personal autonomy in exchange for the almighty dollar, choosing to exchange their immeasurable and divinely gifted creative energy, their V, for these external metrics. And these metrics are the dollars that get generated based on societal approval, or if you're a digital creator, it's the views and the clicks and the likes. And when you start playing the metric game, you sometimes unknowingly, or it creeps in very slowly, you begin to trade the capacity to create certainty through the act of learning and doing in favor of having it created and laid out for you, which is where the checklists and the hacks and the experts have the ability to swoop in and prey on the vulnerabilities and insecurities that live inside of this lack and scarcity mentality. And if you've ever abandoned an idea early on because of initial feedback, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And perhaps you've heard that you're wasting your time creating something if it doesn't meet a pre-sale target or fit neatly inside of a predefined market. And it's this kind of fear-based thinking rooted in the lack mentality that is incredibly short-sighted, but ultimately is a reflection of your own lack of faith and fortitude in your mission and your message. As I said at the beginning of this episode, I had to get really clear on my mission and then commit to the long game if I wanted to see it through, which is why it's become so important for me to create only from my well of lived experiences, because repackaging information is no longer going to cut it going forward. And regardless of what you are creating, you are and always will be your ideal client. And I say this because I've always lived and worked by the motto that I won't ask others to do something that I haven't done or don't know how to do. And anytime I've betrayed this statement, it's caused me a lot of grief. The imposter syndrome just totally takes over. And ultimately, I believe it's because universal law dictates that we are one. So if that is true, and you believe that to be true, why try and create a message and a mission or a product that serves anyone but you first? Which sounds audacious and egocentric, but is it? And this leads me to the second myth that I've had to bust for myself, which is that I must chase success. Almost 20 years of social media has conditioned us to serve the ego through hits of dopamine extracted from external validation. And we can attempt to fool ourselves into believing that we have a unique and altruistic message that makes us immune to the trappings of these particular social contracts. But regardless of how you're entering into this social media contract, the self is always being served first. So discerning whether or not we are in service to the ego or the highest self is where the challenge always lies. And digital creators right now who are psychologically beholden to third-party platforms are currently being held hostage by the algorithms and the censorship. And it's fundamentally shaping how and what they create. I see it happening on YouTube all the time, where high-ranking channels are now practically being, I wouldn't say delisted, but even if you're subscribed to those channels, it's not really showing up in your home feed. And they're struggling to continue to grow their audiences. So they're beginning to try and navigate the landscape through how they're creating their content. But that's a tool of manipulation. It's a censorship. It's a conditioning that's taking place to ensure people move in lockstep. But on the flip side, there are also creators who are not attached to the metrics and refuse to self-censor and are finding even more freedom in their creative process and breeding innovation that elevates themselves and others, which is why you're finding me on Substack right now. Now, as far as social media is concerned, I left the Facebook platform in 2019, and then Instagram in 2020, both for different reasons. I left Facebook in 2019 because I was just annoyed with what I was seeing all day and every day, and the constant need for external validation coming from the people that were in my feed. It felt desperate and sad and mentally draining, and I didn't want to see it anymore. And then with Instagram in 2020, I left because they were fundamentally changing the terms of service and the contracts, and I just did not agree to what they were requiring of their members. And because of this, I won't go back. I'm not going back to any platform, be it Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. And not only because the contracts are corrupt, but I just won't allow myself into being scared into believing that I cannot have a successful business, relevant voice, or impactful presence in this world without it. That I need to chase to be heard instead of just allowing my words and my message to attract who is meant to hear it. And on a much deeper level, this is underpinned by the push and pull of the masculine and feminine polarity, the chasing versus the receiving. As a woman who has come up through this toxic feminist culture, a culture that has really required women embody their masculinity more than their femininity, it's been a really trippy experience to ease into this receive and allow. And it's a challenge that I have every day, but I'm just flowing with it. I'm trying to make it work. But I will say that the challenges and the stories that are being conjured through this way of being is exacerbating unhealed wounds and removing the scabs from those that I thought were on the mend. And it's requiring that I choose curiosity over comfort, and patience over instant gratification, faith over fear, and consistency over internal and external criticisms. And one of those unhealed wounds and scabs that I seem to be picking at is that push and pull between the ego and the higher self, which brings me to the third myth that I've been working on busting, which is that information equals knowledge. It's a big one, especially coming out of the last 3 years and looking at the work that I was doing during that time, really diving into systems and structures and looking at new ways of being and consuming far more information than is healthy or necessary or required. But it was part of my journey, and it was necessary for me to go through that, because on the other side, what I've come up with is that information, as we understand it in terms of consuming news, articles, research, books, etc., information is just masked philosophy. And I say that because unless you are consistently putting the information you're consuming into action and experiencing results for yourself, information is merely an untested hypothesis. And having more of it doesn't make you wise. In fact, I think it makes you dense, because the accumulation of information has the ability to create this density within you that can hinder new beliefs or thoughts or ideas from penetrating your consciousness. And it's only through the act of applying the information that you are ingesting that you can discover truth. And I use the word truth loosely because truth will vary based on your values, your interests, and your experience. Because the lens through which you filter information will never be the same as anyone else, and therefore the results will always vary greatly. And when we fail to question or apply the information we're receiving, it's almost always the root cause of why you may feel sick or stuck or stagnant in one or more areas of your life. The feedback loop that gets generated from applying information yourself is immeasurable and invaluable. And it's also paramount to the creation of your personal reality, because it constructs the foundation for new thoughts and habits and beliefs to build and evolve from. And it's a foundation that, if properly constructed, will allow you to find refuge and reprieve in every season of your life. That means that every time you go through a dark night of the soul, or when the world starts to shake around you, regardless of what comes down, whatever gets burned away, that foundation never changes. And it's why we also have to beware of absolutes and those who espouse them, because absolute thinking is a byproduct of hoarding information, and it can also signify a lack of action. And lack of action prevents learning, and without learning, wisdom cannot exist. This is a loop you're going to hear me talk about a lot. And it's because through my personal experience, I've sat at tables that I wasn't, quote, qualified to sit at. I've successfully challenged laws and policies that were considered to be absolute. I've walked away from toxic environments. I've pushed the limits of my body, and I've healed myself without modern medical intervention simply because I'm willing to apply the information I'm presented with to see if it rings true and then pivot accordingly. I am my greatest experiment. Everything I do feels like a research trial where I'm always just micro adjusting the information that I'm receiving and applying it throughout my life to see what works and what doesn't. To circle back to the very beginning of this conversation and tie everything together, I have come to believe that there kind of is no such thing as an entrepreneur, and that the conflation and embodiment of verbs with nouns is one of the biggest hurdles that we as a collective are facing right now. And it's created the idea of leaders and gurus and elders and power structures that oppress and control instead of uplift and empower. The ideas and beliefs that perpetuate our reliance on the employer-employee relationships are the golden handcuffs that we're being called to break free from as ethical and immoral structures continue to expose themselves. And I do think when you label yourself an entrepreneur, there is still an element of the golden handcuff there, because usually people become entrepreneurs because they want the freedom from what they believe is this constricting and repressive system. All I'm saying is that there is still this underlying element of control that would be beneficial to observe. Empowerment and literacy go hand in hand, and you cannot have one without the other. And literacy is not achieved through the consumption of information, but through the courageous action that allows you to see if what you're being told is true. And the cultivation of this truth becomes the wisdom that gets distilled inside of the intersection of your values, interests, and experience, a wisdom derived from your ability to entreprendre, to do. So you can choose to call yourself an entrepreneur, or you can choose to entreprendre. Choose wisely. This feels like a good place to end. Thank you so much for being here. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this episode if it brought value to you. And also, if you want to join the conversation, jump over to grandrisingexperience.substack.com. From there, you can leave comments on this episode. And if you want to dive deeper into this information and sit with a group of people every month where we openly discuss the pain points in your life and how to transform those pain points into power and purpose, consider joining the Cocoon, the monthly subscription. And if you join now, you will get your first 7 days free. Until next time, thank you so much for being here. I love you.